All right, this video is going to go through and talk about Japanese expansion. So we've talked this whole time, there's many parts to the war here. We've talked this whole time about what Hitler's able to do in Europe. All right, well, there's other members of the Axis party. There's Italy, which you kind of forget about Italy, to be honest with you. Hitler gets super frustrated with Italy because they don't end up holding their end. But they're helping out in like Northern Africa. They're helping establish this as well. But it's mainly the Germans. And then on the other side, you have the Japanese. All right. And so we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about Japan. All right. So the Japanese, much like how the Nazis felt about their European neighbors, the Japanese believed that they too were superior, all right, to all the other Asian countries, China, Indochina, etc. They believed that they were superior, that social Darwinist thinking, where they're like, we're better than them. It's all right to take it over. And not to mention that they also had they're an island nation, so the Great Depression, they don't have that many resources. The Great Depression kind of forced their hand to be like, if we don't do something, people aren't trading goods with us because nobody has anything. So they're going to start to take over countries to really support their economy and support their people because they don't have the resources to do it. They had signed the Tripartite Pact, which we talked about this in Rome, Berlin, Tokyo axis with Germany, September 27th, 1940. They all have really similar goals in terms of how much territory, they're militaristic. They want to take over territory. They think they're superior to other nations. So basically what they did is they allied themselves with Germany, Italy, and they recognized their right to have a European order, and Germany and Italy recognized Japan's right to have a greater East Asian order, and they would defend each other. It was basically a military alliance, all right, which they're going to be known as the Axis powers. And part of the reason why they did that is because there was a lot of pressure from because they had been expanding so aggressively. We already talked about the Manchuria incident up here where they invaded Manchuria prior to the war. Well, they also went into mainland China in 1937, and they did some really disturbing things in China. I mean, the invasion there was brutal. Just how they treated the Chinese people, it's sadistic. But you get the idea. If you read into it too much, we're not going to do it because it's really rough. But just how the Japanese really viewed the Chinese as lesser beings, kind of how the Germans treated the Jews. That's what the Japanese were doing to the Chinese in their treatment to them. Just viewed them as just inferior people that should be taken over. And then they went on and they started going into Indochina. And once the Nazis started attacking Britain and France, they went into all these, Hong Kong was a British territory. They went into all these, the French Indochina. They started going into all these European colonies and taking over as well. All right. And Indochina is what we call today is like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, etc., Thailand. And so they went in and they just started taking over all this territory. And so this is going to worry the U.S. All right, like, why does the U.S. care? All right, well, if they've already gone, they take over all this territory. Hitler has been taking over all of Europe, and the U.S. has done nothing. Why is the U.S. worried about this expansion in Asia? Well, the answer is the Philippines. All right, the Philippines has been a territory that the U.S. acquired in the Spanish-American War. You'll learn more about it next year in Mr. Dickey's class. But they've controlled that territory since 1899, or depending on when you want to say 1900s, after this kind of war with them breaks out. And they have other smaller territories, Guam, etc. But you can see what the problem the U.S. has is Japan is just creating a noose around this territory. All right, they're just putting all of this. They have all of this territory that they are just surrounding the Philippines with all of this territory that they're taking over. And so they just feel, and rightfully so, that if we don't do something like that, the Philippines is going to be next. All right. And so how should they respond? They don't really want a war with them placing that noose around the neck of the Philippines. They don't want a war, but what they do, they figure out we can stop them by placing an embargo. And they've been doing this for a while. This just didn't happen overnight. They had placed trade restrictions on like scrap metal and stuff like that when they invaded Indochina. This isn't anything new, this bad blood between the U.S. and Japan. But this is going to really set it over the top. The U.S. places an embargo, a ban on trading oil to Japan. Oil, once again, Japan is an industrial nation. They're an island nation, and they get most of their oil from the U.S. And so this is going to just destroy their economy, but it's going to cripple their war machine. It's going to end their expansionist aims. Roosevelt said, we'll trade with you again, but you have to leave Indochina, this territory that you had taken over here. You got to leave Indochina. You got to get out of these European colonies. We want you back out of China, but go back to your original borders. And neither side was really willing to budge on this. All right, and so the Japanese really viewed this as an act of war. All right, they're interfering with their goal to create a new Asian order, and they had to be dealt with. So they're sending delegates to negotiate the peaceful end to the embargo, but neither side really is budging. And meanwhile, while they're offering this peace agreement, the whole time they're really just buying more time to launch a surprise attack against the U.S. All right, because they're going to eventually take the Philippines in these areas. But first, the U.S. has a territory here in Pearl Harbor with a large Pacific fleet. And that's what they're going to do. They are going to launch a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. A day which will live in infamy, as Roosevelt described it in a speech to the country. Japan had even greater success than they had hoped. The U.S. was completely caught off guard. They were completely caught by surprise. They obviously thought that they were trying to have peaceful negotiations with the Japanese, and then meanwhile they send this surprise attack. They were able to sink or disable 20 ships, 300 airplanes. They killed 2,400 people. This was up until September 11th. This was the worst attack on U.S. soil by a foreign entity. And so they had overwhelming success. And their goal is just pretty simple. Hey, we can wipe out this Pacific fleet, then they'll be defenseless. We'll be able to control Asia. We'll be able to control the Pacific Ocean. And they went through and they just started wiping out battleships. This is a memorial that exists still to this day. The memorial's built. It's pretty cool. It's built right on top of the USS Arizona. So you can go, and they used to, and they still do, I think, probably to some extent, but these, unfortunately, the generation's starting to die off, where the people that survived the Pearl Harbor attack would give the tours there. My brother-in-law and sister, when they went to Hawaii, they had somebody that lived through it do that. But it trapped 1,000 men inside, and they went to the next battleship and did the same thing, and they destroyed all these battleships. But the attack might have seemed like an overwhelming success, but it didn't really fully annihilate the Pacific Fleet. The U.S. still had several aircraft carriers that they didn't hit. Some were out of port; they weren't there, and they were able to salvage most of the ships. All right, so a few sunk, like the Arizona had sunk. Some other ones had sunk, but for the most part, they were able to salvage and repair many of the ships that had been damaged. But they did succeed at ticking off the United States. All right, so that's one thing. They're going to soon realize that, they're quoted as saying this. I don't know if they actually did, but we might have woken up a sleeping giant. With the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. declares war on Japan, honoring the Tripartite Pact. Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S. Backing the U.S., Britain declares war on Japan. All right, so to recap what we've learned so far up until 1942, and I've already done this a little bit, Hitler has complete control of of Europe. With exception to Great Britain, he really hasn't had a failure. He's invaded very far into the Soviet Union. He's right on the outskirts of Moscow. He's made it really far into Soviet territory. Japan has nearly wiped out the U.S. Pacific Fleet, has complete control of the Pacific. They're going to invade the Philippines. They're going to take the Philippines. They're going to take the East Indies. They're going to take all of this territory. So they have their Asian empire that is established. This ain't good. Not so fast, my friend. Lee Corso for you. Never again will the Axis powers hold such a strong position, thanks to several key Allied victories that we're going to discuss coming up. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Despite their great differences, the U.S. and Britain decide to ally themselves with the Soviet Union. At the Tehran Conference in Iran, in 1943, they agreed to fight the Axis powers until they surrendered, and they developed war strategies to help them claim the ultimate victory. Right? They're going to wipe out. They're going to figure out how the Allied powers can get into Europe to help relieve pressures off the Soviets. Once they wipe out the Germans, the Soviets said, "We'll help you with Japan," and so they This is when they start to collaboratively work together to try to figure out a strategy to claim ultimate victory. All right, and we're going to get into that next.